الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters. This evening I wanted to talk a little bit about the rules, regulations, requirements, etc. for fasting the 6 days of Shawwal. And I'm sorry that we're kind of late in talking about this. We're right about the midpoint of the month of Shawwal, and this is something that generally you want to talk about before Shawwal or right at the beginning of Shawwal, to give people, a good heads up and notification, and to encourage them to get after these days and to make these days or observe these days before the month gets away from us. And here we are at the midpoint. But obviously we did kind of talk about a little bit when we had the Eid sermon. We talked about it, I think, shortly after that when we talked about the action items after Ramadan. But we didn't talk about the ahkam of it, some of the rules and regulations that people need to be mindful of. And we are a little late in the game doing that, but better late than never. And it's better for us to speak about this point and make it clear rather than just leave it undone. And so tonight, inshallah ta'ala, I'd like to address, like I said, these rules and regulations related to the 6 days of Shawwal. First of all, we have the hadith collected by Imam Muslim on the authority of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, in which the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sallam, he said, "Man sama Ramadan thumma atba'u sittan min Shawwal kana kasiyam ad-dahr." Whoever fasted Ramadan and thereafter followed it with 6 days from Shawwal, it would be like fasting the entire year. And what I like to do at the outset is look at the actual words in the hadith and talk about the meanings and implications of those words before talking about some of the lessons we can extrapolate from the hadith in its entirety. So at the outset, the Prophet begins the hadith by saying men, which we've translated as whoever. And this is an expression indicating generality and all-inclusiveness. So that means that the ruling of this hadith, what follows, is applicable to every person to whom it can rightfully apply. Male or female, young or old, any person from whom fasting is valid, this hadith or this ruling applies to them. This word men is also a particle for conditional clauses, which makes this a conditional sentence, which means that the reward mentioned at the end of the sentence is predicated or conditioned on the fulfillment of the prerequisites mentioned in the beginning. So when the Prophet ﷺ, when he says at the end of the hadith, "Kana kasiyam ad-dahr," it would be as if he fasted the entire year. The conditions which are mentioned, that reward is predicated on the fulfillment and checking of the boxes of the conditions laid out in the first part. And if we look at the hadith, "Man sama Ramadan thumma atba'ahu sittan min Shawwal," we see that there are basically 3 conditions that the Prophet mentioned in order for us to receive this reward of being as if we fasted the entire year. The first one is that we have to fast Ramadan its entirety. "Man sama Ramadan," whoever fasted Ramadan. Number 2, we have to follow Ramadan with 6 additional days of fasting. ثُمَّ أَتْبَعْهُ سِتًّا, right? Whoever followed it with 6 days. And that those 6 additional days must occur in the month of Shawwal. ثُمَّ أَتْبَعْهُ سِتًّا مِنْ Shawwal. Followed it with 6 days from Shawwal. And so these are the 3 conditions or prerequisites that are basically listed and necessary for us to get the reward mentioned at the end of the hadith. Then the Prophet, he said, "Sama Ramadan," fasted Ramadan, which means he completed the required number of days of fasting, 29 or 30 days, depending on the length of the month in any given year. And that doesn't matter whether he completed those days within the month ada'an, as prescribed, or afterwards qada'an, making up any missed days due to an excuse or concession. So when the Prophet says "Man sama Ramadan," that could be that the person fasted the days of Ramadan in the actual month of Ramadan. But it also includes a person who had 1 or 2 or 3 or a few days that they missed from Ramadan, and then they made up those days at the beginning of Shawwal. And once they make up those days, they are considered to be from those who have fasted Ramadan, completed the fasting of Ramadan, and then now what? The hadith, or the remainder of the hadith applies to them. Then he said, thumma atba'ahu. Thumma, and thereafter. This word thumma is a conjunction that implies tearing or lagging behind as opposed to concurrence. So the use of thumma indicates that the 6 days of Shawwal should only be observed after all the days of Ramadan are completed, and that the 6 days should neither. So basically what that does is that disallows two methods of observing the 6 days. One of them is that a person begins to begins to observe the 6 days before making up any unobserved days or missed days from Ramadan. So that's one surah that's disallowed by the word thumma. That some people, what they'll do is they'll have like a couple of days, 3 days, 4 days, a few days from Ramadan, and then Shawwal will come in, and they'll start with the 6 days of Shawwal, and then they'll make up the days of Ramadan later. Well, this word thumma, it disallows that, because it's saying that basically Ramadan has to be complete, and then thereafter, lagging behind that, tearing behind that, should be these 6 days of Shawwal after the completion of Ramadan. It also disallows that one performs the fasting of the 6 days and the fasting of Ramadan concurrently, with the niyyah of fasting in Shawwal and making up the missed days of Ramadan simultaneously, because the Prophet said thumma, that one should follow the other. This is further emphasized by him saying thumma atba'ahu, he follows it, which means that the requirement that this further emphasizes that the requirement is that all the days of Ramadan must be completed. It makes that incredibly clear. It also makes it clear that this is a condition for the reward stated at the end of the hadith, that the fasting of the 6 days must follow the fasting of the completion of the fasting or the days of the fast of Ramadan. Then he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sitten, 6. This sitten is an indefinite noun in the context of a conditional clause. Nakiratun fi siyaq ash-shart. And that indicates generality, which means that any 6 days will suffice, whether those 6 days were done consecutively, one after the other. So for example, a person started on Monday and completed on Saturday, right? That's one way the person could do it. They could also disperse them. Fast one Monday, then a Thursday, a Monday and a Wednesday and a Thursday. He could do any type of configuration. Doesn't have to be consecutive, because the Prophet said sitten, that makes it what? General. Any 6 days, as long as those 6 days are in what? Shawwal. Also, it could be in the beginning of the month, the middle of the month, or the end of the month. It also indicates that the reward is predicated on that specific number of days. He said thumma atba'ahu sitten. He didn't say sab'an, he didn't say khamsan, he didn't say arba'an. So what that means is that if a person offered 4 or even if they offered 5, right there on the precipice, right on the edge of making it to 6, they wouldn't get the reward, because what is required to get this reward is that you fast 6 days, not 5 days or 4 days or 3 days from Shawwal. Then he concluded the hadith by saying, then he concluded that the prerequisite part of it by saying min Shawwal indicates that the promised reward will only be attainable if all 6 of these days occur or are observed in Shawwal. Then he concluded the hadith by saying, kana kasiyam ad-dahr, it would be as if he fasted the entire year. And that is because Allah is promising, the way that this works, the scholars have explained, how is this so? Well, basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising us that when we fast the month of Ramadan, that the least that we will stand to gain is 10 times the value of those days of fasting. Al-hasanatu bi ashri amthaliha. So 30 days of fasting will be equivalent to 300 days of fasting. And then if we add 6 days from Shawwal times 10, that will be 60 days, 360 days, a complete lunar year of fasting. By what? In terms of reward. Not in terms of what we did, but in terms of the reward that Allah is going to give us in exchange for that. Now there are a few lessons, ma yustafadu min al-hadith, and I'd like to mention those ala ujala, and this is where the ahkam come in, the rulings come in, and some of the other benefits from the hadith. So we'll mention those ala ujala. The first one is that this hadith teaches us that fasting the 6 days of Shawwal is something which is highly recommended, highly rewardable, a highly encouraged act, one which pleases Allah a great deal. We can earn Allah's pleasure and His reward by fasting these 6 days. And this is the opinion of the majority of the scholars, including Abu Hanifa, Ash-Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahumullahu ta'ala. They all considered this, and the followers of the madhab all consider this to be a highly recommended fast, voluntary fast. The only dissenter, as you can tell, is Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, who was of the opinion that fasting the 6 days of Shawwal is makruh. It is disliked. It is discouraged. It is disapproved of. But Ibn Abd'Llah, one of the leading scholars of the Maliki madhab and one of the muhaqqiqeen of that madhab, he basically explained that هذا الحديث لم يبلغ الإمام مالك ولو بلغه لقال به. He said that the reason why Malik was of the opinion that fasting the 6 days of Shawwal is disapproved of or disliked is because this hadith, he was simply not aware of it. He wasn't aware of this hadith. And had he been aware of it, Ibn Abd'Llah, he goes on to say, had he been aware of it, he would have certainly followed the hadith. And this is important for two reasons. I'll just mention this as a side point. And that is that we learn from this two things. One is that these imams, as knowledgeable as they were, they didn't know everything. And so that teaches us that no matter how knowledgeable the scholar is, he doesn't know everything. He can make mistakes because no one has the complete knowledge of Islam except Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They are the ones who have the complete knowledge of the deen. As for the scholars who come after them, come after the Prophet ﷺ, then yes, they're going to miss some things. They're not going to know everything. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. The second thing that we benefit is that these scholars are not people who put their opinions above the hadith or before the hadith. That yes, sometimes they have opinions which oppose the hadith, but if that happens, it happens due to a lack of knowledge, not due to a intentional flouting of the evidences and the texts. That once they are aware of the text, they follow the texts. And if they do not follow the text, it is usually because they are not aware of the text, or they have some reason to believe that that text is not authentic, or it doesn't mean what people interpret it to mean, etc. But the bottom line is that the scholars of Islam that we respect and we love and we admire and we look up to, they are people who follow the text and they do not flout or oppose or run roughshod over the texts. The second lesson from the hadith is we see from the hadith the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this ummah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has favored us by making us work less but receive more. And you see this in a lot of examples, and one example is this example of fasting the 6 days of Shawwal. That basically Allah has made it possible for this ummah to receive the reward as if they had fasted perpetually. Every single day of the year, they get the reward as if they fasted the entire year, when they've only fasted a total of 36 or 35 days, depending on the length of Ramadan in any given year. That is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this ummah, that He made it possible for us to achieve a great deal of reward. In this case, the reward for fasting the entire year, but in a way which does not cause us any undue hardship or difficulty. The third lesson that we take from the hadith is that although, because the wording of the hadith is general, sittan, although we can fast any 6 days of the month of Shawwal, it is best if we try to fast those days as early as possible in the month. That we don't delay, that we don't procrastinate. We should fast them as early and as quickly as possible. And the reasons for this, the scholars have mentioned about 3 of them, and there could be more, but these are 3 good reasons that they mentioned. One is that in general in Islam we are encouraged to hasten to do good deeds, not to delay in doing the good deeds. In doing good deeds, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. Hasten to do the good deeds. Race in the doing of good deeds. Number 2, you never know what circumstances can arise that will prevent you from fasting. That a person may enter the month of Shawwal after Ramadan and be in good health, have plenty of free time on their hands, etc. and they put it off. I'm going to do it later. I'll do it next week. I'll start the middle of the month, etc. And then when the middle of the month comes, they have some business travel that they have to do, or some personal circumstances, situations that prevent them from fasting, or some illness. And so the window of opportunity closes, and now that they have the time that they set aside, or they had planned to fast, now there's a circumstance that prevents them from fasting. So when we're able to fast, we don't delay. We get after it immediately. And then thirdly, the scholars mention that the 6 days of Shawwal are similar, very similar to the rawatib. They are very similar to the sunan prayers that we observe after the fard prayers. Those which are connected to the fard prayers, and they are supposed to be observed immediately following those fard prayers, not delayed. And they say similarly, a Shawwal is similar to these rawatib and should be observed after. And related to that comes a fourth lesson, which should give us even more incentive to observe the 6 days of Shawwal, is that because the 6 days of Shawwal are likened to the rawatib, those supererogatory voluntary prayers which are connected to the obligatory prayers, they serve a similar purpose, and that is that they make up for any shortcomings in the fast. Just like the sunan al-rawatib make up for any shortcomings in our obligatory prayer, the 6 days of Shawwal and other voluntary fasts will make up for the shortcomings in our obligatory fasting. And we know the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that a person will come and they'll be asked about their prayer, and that prayer will be evaluated. And if there are any shortcomings in that prayer, Allah will ask the angels, does my servant have any supererogatory prayers to make up for these shortcomings? And if he does, those supererogatory prayers will be brought and make up for that. He said likewise will be done for the other the other fara'id, the other obligatory deeds, including fasting. Number 5 from the points, and this is important, this is a mas'ala, a question that commonly gets raised. And that is, if a person has days remaining from the month of Ramadan. This is very common for our sisters, that they may have some days that they were not able to fast in Ramadan. They come to Shawwal, and they're worried about Shawwal ending before they are able to make up the missed days of Ramadan. So the question is, can we just go ahead and fast the 6 days of Shawwal and then make up those days of Ramadan? Now, although we've talked about how the hadith is it seems to be very clear about this, the scholars of Islam have differed about that. And Allah knows best, the weightiest of the two opinions appears to be that it's not permitted for one to fast the 6 days of Shawwal before they fast the obligatory, make up the missed days of the obligatory fast of Ramadan. Not only that, but the voluntary fast, if they were to offer a voluntary fast of any kind before making up the missed days of Ramadan, those days would not be accepted. They would not be accepted or considered valid until a person first made up the missed days of Ramadan. And this is the most widely recognized opinion of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, and supported by, first and foremost, the wording of the hadith. The apparent wording of the hadith is clear that there are 3 boxes we have to check before we can get the reward mentioned in the hadith. The first one is we have to complete the fasting of Ramadan. Then we have to follow that fasting with 6 days, and those 6 days should occur in Shawwal. Check, check, check. So the first of those boxes we have to check is that the fasting of Ramadan must be complete. The second supporting evidence for the opinion of Ahmad is the narration, authentic narration from Abu Hurairah, collected by Abd'Llah in his book Al-Musannaf, in which he mentions that a man came to Abu Hurairah and he asked him, he said, "Alayya ayyaman min Ramadan, afa asum al-ashr tatawwan?" He said, I have some days remaining that I need to make up from Ramadan. Should I fast the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah? Can I go ahead and fast these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah voluntarily and then make up the days of Ramadan after that? Abu Hurairah, he said, La. He said, no, don't do that. So the man said, Walima. He said, why not? So Abu Hurairah, he responded by saying, Ibda bihaqqillah thumma tatawwa bima shit. He said, begin with Allah's right, then thereafter fast voluntarily as you like. So this shows that the understanding of Abu Hurairah, this great companion, was that we cannot fast a non-obligatory fast until we've completed the obligatory fast of Ramadan if we miss days from Ramadan. Finally, there is a little bit of an ishkal here, especially, as I said, for our sisters, that they may actually have every intention of completing the fasting that they've missed from Ramadan. And maybe they have 10 days, 12 days they have to make up. And then they have those 6 days, and they are sincerely afraid. They have good reason to be afraid that the time, the month, there's just not enough days left in the month for me to get those 6 days in. What we say to those sisters is fast. Make up the days for Ramadan and then fast your 6 days from Shawwal. If you end up with 4 days, if you end up with 5 days, if you end up with 3 days, inshallah ta'ala, the hope and the prayer is that if you try to follow this hadith, the letter of the hadith, and comply with the instructions of Rasulullah, and you came up short due to no fault of your own, the hope is that you will reach by virtue of your intention what you did not reach by virtue of your actual actions. And there are a few hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that a person can obtain the reward for his intention that he didn't obtain from what? From his actual action. And in one particular hadith, he mentioned that he was with it was mentioned that he was with a group of his companions on an expedition. And he stopped and he turned to them and he said that there are people that we left behind in Medina. They couldn't come with us. Not because they didn't want to come, not because they were lazy or they had some illegitimate excuse, but because they had a legitimate excuse, there were circumstances beyond their control that prevented them from joining us for this expedition. You have not crossed a plain. You have not descended to a valley. You have not climbed a mountain, except that they were with us in terms of their reward, reaching what we have reached by our actions through their intention. And so my encouragement to our sisters and even to our brothers who may have missed some days due to circumstances beyond their control, illness, etc., and now they're trying to make up those days and get what they can get of Shawwal, fast. Do the best that you can, and inshallah ta'ala, what you don't make from actual observance and practice, you'll get it from Allah with your intention. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it, and may He make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge and who He benefits truly with that knowledge, by making us from those who practice it. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.